This is Steve Young for the Co-Roundtable. I'd like to talk briefly about the intersection of systems, which is so important if we're talking about how the quality of life that we human beings have in various ways. So roughly speaking, we have two big systems. We have markets, we have capitalism, we have business, we have transactions, profit and loss, and then we have governments. There are elections, some governments are not elected, they use law, they have regulations, they tell us what to do, they set incentives, they set punishments, and the two interact. How do we optimize what we get from ourselves, from our systems? Oh, and by the way, I've left out a third system, which we call civil society. Churches, religion, schools, nonprofits, et cetera, et cetera. But I ran across two sort of related points on what happens when the intersection is good and what happens when the intersection is not so good. An example of a good intersection between government and well-being is the African country of Botswana in relation to diamonds. In 1967, De Beers, the great private corporation mining giant coming out of South Africa, discovered a lot of diamonds in Botswana. Now, mostly in Africa, a lot of the natural resources in Africa is very wealthy in terms of natural resources. The World Bank predicts, however, that by 2030, 62% of the world's very poor people will live in resource-rich sub-Saharan countries, up from 12% in 2000. Now, what does that mean? That means the rest of the economies are going to be growing faster, and people will be somehow, one way or another, they're going to get wealthier and wealthier. And in Africa, the richness that those countries have is not going to be shared with the people. What's going on? I would suggest it's a structural phenomenon. The article talks about what Botswana did differently. It basically offered secure property rights and a stable, clear tax regime. Today, the private company that takes all these diamonds out of the ground and sells them reckons that Botswana keeps 4/5 of the revenue from this particular mine, the joint mining venture, through taxes, royalties, and dividends. Then Botswana has a way of using that money wisely to help its people. Too many African countries have spent the proceeds of resource booms before they arrive. They just borrow money. In Botswana, a stabilization fund helps smooth boom and bust cycles. The government has minimized what they call the Dutch disease, whereby all this money in the beginning causes the local currency to rise, making it more expensive and making other exports less competitive. Botswana was able to keep the value of its currency more stable so that the wealth could be distributed and people did not have to suffer from the impact of deflation of their earnings. And then in Latin America, there was a comment that Latin America has had abysmal growth. In 1962, Latin America's income per person was 3 times that of East Asia. By 2012, both regions had the same level. By 2022, East Asia was roughly 40% higher than Latin America in terms of income per person. And the question is why? The region is not short of workers, it says. This particular article goes to Latin American workers are not so productive. Why is that? One reason they talk to is companies, that's the private sector, are not investing a lot in Latin America in order to train workers, in order to bring in higher technology, which then means you need higher skilled workers, you can pay them higher wages, they are more productive thanks to the machinery, and they get more money to live with and to take care of their families and spend in society. Another factor is education. Before COVID-19, Latin American 15-year-olds were, on average, 3 years behind their peers in the OECD on science, math, and English tests. The gap is likely to be worse now. Well, who's responsible for education? The government. And who does the government respond to? The poor, the middle class, the elite? You probably know as well as I do. My suspicions are. The third factor is lots of monopolies and oligopolies. These are elite-driven societies, where in Chile, the 50 biggest firms account for more than 70% of GDP, which means a whole lot of people, if you don't work for the 50 biggest firms, you're not generating a lot of wealth. So what's your salary share going to be? Very small. And who's responsible for the concentration of economic power in oligopolies, monopolies? Some of them are state companies, some of them are not. Is there an intertwining of wealth, social prestige, business, government, politics, so that basically advantages flow to the few? And then in this situation, you can also measure that more than half the workforce is employed informally. They don't have formal jobs in companies, which pay regular salaries and then maybe have retirement benefits and things like that. In Bolivia, 82% of the workers are sort of living hand to mouth on gigs they can get here and there. That's no way to build up productivity in your workforce. So what are these Latin American states doing to increase the value of their human capital? I would say not much.